Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for a talk on plant guilds, or taking companion planting to the next level. My name is Rebecca Last. I'm a member of Master Gardeners of Ottawa-Carleton, and I garden in Ottawa, which is Zone 5A, although my garden is on the north side of a hill and more like 4B. If you're listening to this from the United States, that's roughly equivalent to USDA Grow Zone 4. Plant guilds are both a relatively new concept and a very old idea. Early Europeans arriving on the eastern shores of North America commented that in some places they were seeing beautiful park-like forests. That's because for generations, Aboriginal peoples had practiced sustainable food forest gardening through selective planting, harvesting, and clearing by burning. Unfortunately, those early settlers didn't take the time to study the food forest gardens of Indigenous people, so today we're trying to relearn what plants go together harmoniously. This is still very much an evolving field of study and is generally considered an important part of the larger field called permaculture. A cautionary note is that permaculturalists place high value on useful plants. Throughout this presentation, I may refer to plants having food or medicinal value. This is not meant as advice. Do your own research, decide for yourself what unconventional plants you want to try eating, and use special caution when trying them for yourselves. You should also never try at-home herbal remedies without first seeking professional advice. So during today's talk, we're going to cover some definitions and talk about the difference between plant guilds versus companion planting. We'll talk about how we tend to baby our gardens, and that's not always a good thing. We really need to treat our gardens as mature ecosystems, and as a lazy gardener, I can tell you that's a heck of a lot easier than the babying approach. In order to have a mature ecosystem in our garden, of course, we need to ensure that the plants in our garden fulfill various ecosystem functions. We'll start by talking about two multi-talented plants, and then more generally about those ecosystem functions. And finally, I'll give you some examples of plant guilds. So let's start with some definitions. According to Wikipedia, plant guilds are any group of species that exploit the same resources, often in related ways, and they are defined according to the locations, attributes, and the activities of component species. Companion planting is generally designed to minimize harm. It entails close planting of different plants to enhance each other's growth or to protect each other from pests. Whereas plant guilds were really looking to capitalize on positive interactions and synergy between not just plants, but animals, insects, and other components of the ecosystem, all working together to ensure their mutual survival. And really, I like the definition that plant guilds are any group of plants which support each other while growing near each other. So as I said, the concept of plant guilds comes from the field of permaculture. And what's permaculture? Well, it's one of those made-up words. It was first coined by Australians David Holmgren, then a graduate student, and his professor Bill Mollison in 1978. These two agricultural scientists were concerned about the damage that they saw Western European agriculture was doing to Australia's very fragile environment. And they contrasted this with the kind of agriculture that was practiced in many Pacific islands in Micronesia. And in that context, what they were seeing was that many of the food crops were perennial rather than the annual food crops that most of us still eat today. So the word permaculture is a made-up word that comes from combining the words permanent and agriculture. It can be defined as the development of agricultural ecosystems intended to be sustainable and self-sufficient. It's a conscious design and way of maintaining agriculturally productive systems that have diversity, stability, and the resilience of natural ecosystems. So if you think about this in the context of our home gardens, what we're seeing is that perhaps by replicating natural ecosystems in our backyard, we can acquire a more stable and resilient form of gardening, and one that takes a whole lot less work. Permaculturalists are renowned for food forest gardens, and in fact, the plant guild is a building block for a food forest garden. Permaculture ethics include people care, ensuring that there is enough food for people for today. Earth care, ensuring that we're taking care of Mother Earth and not abusing her bounty. And fair share. And this can be everything from composting the surplus in your backyard to sharing food with your neighbors to ensuring social justice. And on that last point, the definition of permaculture has in fact shifted over the years, so we now see it not only as permanent and agriculture, but permanent and culture, implying social justice as well. So what do we mean when we say that plant guilds are taking companion planting to the next level? In the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the differences and similarities between companion planting and plant guilds. Let's start off with the time frame. Most of what we eat today are annual plants, and companion planting reflects this because we're typically using annual plants that will last for a single year, so these combinations can be changed around from year to year. With plant guilds, our centerpiece is typically a woody tree, a species that's going to last for years, probably decades. And consequently, the whole system will last a lot longer, and we have to spend a lot more time thinking about how we organize it from the get-go. In terms of complexity, companion planting, we're usually talking about 2 or 3 plants, and these provide a few ecological functions. Think, for example, of the indigenous classic 3 sisters, beans, squash, and corn. They support each other, the beans provide nitrogen, there's a few ecological functions there. But with plant guilds, we really want to have multiple species, many more combinations are possible, and ideally we're filling many more ecological niches that will become more complex over time. So think, for example, of planting an oak tree. We plant the oak tree, but the birds and the squirrels and the other critters are going to move in of their own accord. In terms of the philosophical context, plant guilds grow from the permaculture movement, as we've said, and companion planting comes out of the organic growing movement. The aesthetics of companion planting can be relatively neat and constrained, whereas with plant guilds, we have a much more messy and sometimes apparently chaotic appearance. So what about the objectives of companion planting versus plant guilds? Companion planting is primarily about minimizing harm, avoiding competition for space and resources, reducing the buildup of pests and diseases in the environment, and it can have some positive environmental effects as well. With plant guilds, however, the ultimate goal is to create a closed-loop system that minimizes inputs, both our own and those of nature, while producing abundantly. And for those who are unfamiliar with the term throughput, what we're really talking about there are things that come into the system but then go out as waste. And again, this is part of what we want to avoid with a closed-loop system. When we compare plant guilds to companion planting, the difference in productivity, or return on investment, ROI, is staggering. We're talking about the energy return on investment. The ratios show energy we put into the system, including our own labor, as the first number, and the energy, think food calories, that we get out of the system is the second number. Most of us know that the average bite of supermarket food has traveled about 1,500 miles or 2,200 kilometers to reach us. There are many inputs to conventional farming: seeds, often chemically coated, or proprietary that have to be purchased every year. All the other inputs, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all of which require energy to manufacture, distribute, and apply. Then there's tilling, sowing, and harvesting by machine, all of which require fossil fuels. So the average return on investment for conventional agriculture is about 1 unit of energy in to 1/10 of a unit of energy out. That's a pretty poor return and clearly not sustainable. Organic agriculture is better, but still only about 1-to-1. Think of all the steps that go into growing your own food. You buy your seeds, or you save your own, which requires your labor. You need to start those seeds, often indoors, under lights, again, requiring energy. The little seedlings will have to be transplanted out, more labor. They need to be watered, weeded, and harvested, all steps that take more energy, even if it's just our labor as gardeners. Most importantly, the returns from conventional and organic agriculture tend to decline over time. Even with crop rotation and companion planting, organic gardeners need to constantly amend their soil to maintain fertility, and that's another input. Now, what about the productivity of plant guilds? Imagine that you planted a small apple tree last season. It likely didn't bear fruit the first year, and maybe won't for several more seasons. But once it starts, you'll get more and more fruit every year, and you won't need to do much other than prune occasionally, maybe do a little pest control, and harvest. In a few years, you're likely to have more apples than you can use. Except during extended droughts, you probably won't have to water after the tree is established. So the average return on investment from a perennial plant guild is about 1 unit of energy in to 50 units of energy out. As a gardener, you're working a lot less and harvesting a lot more, with productivity rising every year. In fact, some proponents of permaculture estimate that a mature garden will yield up to 500 times the output of what goes in. Next, we come to the environmental impact of the two systems. Companion planting within an organic growing regime is minimally negative. It does little harm, but as we mentioned, our annual plants are not providing many ecosystem functions. However, a properly constructed plant guild will perform multiple ecosystem functions. The overall impact is positive, from promoting biodiversity to providing habitat for wildlife and to sequestering carbon in the soil, all while taking less work on our part and producing with increasing abundance in each successive year. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Now, what do we mean when we say that we are babying our gardens? So many of us get a garden to the point where we really like it. We have our perfect lawn. We have our beautifully edged flower beds. The tree is exactly the right size. We've limbed it up to the point where we get sun underneath it. We love the planting combinations we've got, and we try our damnedest to keep things exactly as they are. Well, that's a losing battle, and anybody who's gardened in the same place for any length of time knows that stuff just doesn't stay still. It doesn't stay where you put it. Even our favorite perennials are going to die eventually. Some of them are quite short-lived. Blanket flower typically maybe a couple of years. The mellows, 2 or 3 years. And then you know what? They self-seed and they pop up somewhere else. And your choice is, do you want to try and transplant them and maybe lose them? What about that tree that we limbed up? It's going to age. Eventually it's going to die. I've been gardening in the same garden for about 30 years now, and I've already gone through a couple of trees. Shorter-lived birch trees and a small spruce, both of which lasted for a few years. I really enjoyed them. And then eventually they just died, and I had to find a way to replace them. I had to live with that constantly changing ecosystem. So why am I showing you a picture of an abandoned vacant lot? We see those weeds popping up. Those are the pioneer species that even breaking through asphalt and hardpan, life is finding a way. And those pioneer species with the deep tap roots are breaking up the asphalt and after a few years, we're going to see that those little annuals will start to get replaced by perennial plants. As those little annual weeds die off, they deposit small amounts of organic material that breaks down, and you find soil forming in the cracks. And then larger species, more perennial species, can find a foothold. And eventually you'll even see woody species taking over a vacant lot. Nature doesn't stand still. Nature abhors a vacuum, and she's going to grow things to fill whatever space we provide for her. So, as gardeners, we can take a lesson from these vacant lots and realize that trying to keep things exactly as they are is not going to work for us. Let's work with nature and work a lot less hard to keep things looking nice by working with the rhythms of nature and with plants that blow in or die off and are replaced. So keeping in mind that what we really want to do with our gardens is to create a comprehensive ecosystem, let's start by looking at a couple of multi-talented plants and the kind of ecosystem functions that these plants will provide for us. So first up, we have the white oak. Although the illustration comes from the Texas A&M Forest Service, white oaks are also native this far north. In fact, they're one of the species that grows quite frequently in this part of the world. Now, in an interactive talk, I would be asking you as my audience what kinds of functions you think we can get from a white oak. But of course, I can't hear you answer, so let's start off with the obvious one. Lovely big tree. It's going to give us some shade. But that shade also creates other interesting ecosystem functions. For example, there's a differential temperature between the different levels of the tree, and this helps to create cooling breezes. So we're not just getting some shade, we're getting some air movement that will help to cool things off. Of course, oak trees are wonderful habitat. They provide food and shelter for birds, insects, and other wildlife. Now, it may sound a bit silly, but all of those critters are also going to provide some fertilization for your garden. And what about water cycling? A mature oak tree can transpire up to 2,000 gallons of water on a hot, dry day. That's a heck of a lot of water. And by transpire, we're essentially talking about the plant sweating that water out. And then dust, pollen, and other particles, including those little bits of evaporated moisture that are being transpired by the plant, they're rising from the plant itself, and they can actually help to seed clouds. The shade from the tree helps to retain water in the soil. The roots also retain water and stabilize the soil. And they're going to attract and sustain beneficial soil organisms, such as mycorrhizae. For example, some of the mushrooms that we really like to eat are an essential symbiote for the quercus or oak species. Then we have carbon and oxygen cycling happening as a result of the work of this one plant. It provides air purification. A mature oak tree might have anywhere up to 30 acres of leaf surface that traps dust and other airborne particles. I mentioned the fertilizer from animals living in the tree, but of course the tree itself is constantly shedding bits of organic matter, pollen, dust, mold spores, small branches, and even the oak leaves. Now, we know oak leaves are notoriously slow to break down, but they do break down, and they're constantly helping to enrich the soil. And finally, we have the acorns, which are a traditional food source for First Peoples of North America. Of course, an oak tree is a pretty big plant, and some of you might be wondering, well, what about smaller plants? So let's take a look at a simple herbaceous plant. This is comfrey, or Symphytum officinale, a member of the Boraginaceae plant family. And it's a plant that's been used medicinally for centuries. There are illustrations of comfrey in Basil Besler's Hortus Eistetenstes, I'm sure I mispronounced that, which is the earliest large folio of botanical information, published near Nuremberg in the year 1613. Comfrey is traditionally known as knitbone because it was thought to speed healing. Now, in actual fact, it does contain the chemical allantoin, which has been proven as an anti-inflammatory. Allantoin is also commonly used in cosmetics, especially skin creams, and has been named in over 10,000 patents, most of which are medicinal or cosmetic in nature. Those small blue or mauve flowers, they're actually shown as white in this particular illustration, so you get a range of colors of flowers. But they're highly attractive to bees and other pollinators. And then the big fuzzy leaves, which are very abundant and grow quite rapidly, make excellent mulch material. Now take a look at those big roots. My goodness. Fleshy roots that go deep into the soil. They're great for breaking up hardpan if you have clay soil. And they're going to be delving down to the subsoil level, accessing nutrients such as potassium, calcium, and magnesium, all of which are essential nutrients or micronutrients for plant growth and development. The leaves of comfrey have been used, even recently, as cattle fodder because they contain about 35% protein. Apparently cattle don't much like comfrey, but they'll eat it if there's nothing else available. Now again, I want to make sure that you understand that internal use of comfrey is discouraged because this plant also contains toxic alkaloids, so don't go eating the stuff yourself. It should certainly be avoided either internally or externally by pregnant women. And timing the harvest is also important. The concentration of harmful alkaloids is greatest in the early spring and in the roots. And finally, as anybody who's grown this plant will tell you, it can be pretty invasive. The flowers are usually infertile, but those honking great big roots can grow from even a small section a whole new plant. So if you do have comfrey and want to remove it, just do your best to take all of the roots out as well. You leave even one little piece behind, you're going to have a whole new plant. So having explored the multiple functions we can get from just two specific plants, let's look more generally at the ecosystem functions we need in our gardens. First up, we have the mulch makers. As we discussed, the comfrey plants' abundant growth and soft leaves are two key characteristics of mulch makers. We're also looking for plants that grow quickly or that tend to be messy and drop litter. And of course, we want plants that are multi-talented so that even in a small garden, we can fill as many ecosystem functions as possible. The one kind of plant we don't want to use for mulch are allelopathic plants. Allelopathy is an evolutionary adaptation, a kind of chemical warfare some plants use to reduce competition from their neighbors. All members of the Juglans tree family, walnuts, heartnuts, and butternuts, are allelopathic, as are sunflowers. Other plants with allelopathic properties include sumac, rhododendrons, elderberries, forsythia, and goldenrod or solidago. We don't want to use these plants to make mulch because doing so might harm or kill the plants we're trying to protect with our mulch. So let's look at some examples. Beans have the abundant soft growth that makes them good mulch makers, but they also offer food value and fix nitrogen in the soil. And in my garden, they seem to be a good trap crop for Japanese beetles, who will eat the bean leaves and leave a lot of other plants alone. I'm perfectly okay with that because I'm not going to eat the bean leaves. Nasturtiums are one of my favorite annuals. They're so ornamental, cascading over the edge of a raised bed. Every part of the nasturtium is edible, and the flowers make a great addition to salads. They're an excellent trap crop for pests such as aphids and earwigs, and they have pest repellent properties too. Virginia creeper, Parthenocissus cankifolia, is a native plant, but it has a bit of a bad rap because it tends to be kind of thuggish. However, that rapid growth also makes it an excellent screen plant. I have one growing on a telephone pole and guy wire in my front yard, and it does a great job of camouflaging what would otherwise be an eyesore. It's a very messy plant, constantly dropping bits of itself everywhere. But what it's really doing is mulching my garden for me all by itself. Isn't that nice? In spring, its flowers are not too conspicuous for us, but the bees and other pollinators just love them. Birds eat the purple blueberries in late summer and then leave rather pretty lavender-colored bird poop to help fertilize your garden. And in fall, it's hard to beat that showstopper red foliage. Passers-by often ask what kind of a tree I'm growing when they see that gorgeous foliage covering my telephone pole. We normally rip out leafy weeds such as burdock, plantain, clover, etc. These can be composted either in your compost bin or in situ just by leaving them on the surface of the soil. Many aquatic plants have very rapid growth. I like to use duckweed as a shade plant in my little pond. I harvest it every spring from a secret location in the Gatineau Hills because it's not a plant you can buy in nurseries. But by late June, I'm often ripping handfuls of the stuff out of my pond. It's a plant with tiny leaves that hold a lot of water, and it breaks down very quickly. So I use those handfuls of duckweed as mulch around the less drought-tolerant plants in my garden. Now we come to the nutrient accumulators, and these are distinct from nitrogen fixers. Typically, nutrient accumulators are pioneer species, often classified as weeds, and they will often have a deep taproot or a fibrous, diffuse root system, but their primary function is to draw nutrients up from the subsoil. So in that first shot of the vacant lot, a lot of the species we were seeing in that picture were nutrient accumulators. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to plant a lot of weeds in your garden. There are a good number of attractive garden plants that will perform this function for you. Yarrow, which also has great value as an ornamental plant and for pollinators. Chamomile, which can be used for tea and for dyeing. Fennel, which has food value and value as an ornamental plant as well because it's quite pretty. Lamb's quarters. Now, a lot of people think of the lamb's quarters as a weed. In fact, I used to think that, and I was up at my community garden watching a woman a few plots over harvesting armfuls of this stuff, and I said to her, "Are you weeding?" And she was quite offended. She said, "No, indeed." She was taking the lamb's quarters home for dinner. She called it wild spinach. And in fact, it's got not only the normal nutrients that you find in leafy green vegetables, but it's also got some protein in it, so it's a good edible. Chicory, which has a number of uses, and the dandelion species, a much maligned but extremely useful species. All parts of the dandelion are edible, and in fact, because it blooms so early in the season and has such a nectar-rich flower, it's a very important flower for our native bumblebees. Dandelions bloom at about the same time that the bumblebee queens are emerging from hibernation. They've been fasting all winter and they're starving. So before you rip out a dandelion from your garden, give some thought to our poor native bumblebees and think about leaving the flower and maybe going back and getting the seed head before it spreads everywhere. And finally, plantain, which is also something that we think of as a weed, but its common name, or one of them, is waybread because it has been a food species for years. And now we come to the nitrogen fixers, and of course many of us are familiar with beans, peas, clover. There are also some ornamentals that are nitrogen fixers, such as false indigo, Baptisia australis, beautiful stately ornamental plant that also fixes nitrogen. And until I did the research for this presentation, I wasn't aware that there are some woody species that also are nitrogen fixers. And these include Carragina arborensis, the Siberian pea shrub, the locust trees, Gladitsia species, which have become a very popular street tree, certainly in the Ottawa area. And this last one, Russian olive or Elegansis angustifolia, Be careful about that one because it has been declared an invasive in some areas, although it's still really only marginally hardy in the Ottawa area. And it has the most beautiful fragrance when it's in bloom in the spring, and again, a major attractor for pollinator. So, these nitrogen-fixing plants, of course, are the ones that harbor bacteria or fungi among their roots, and that enables the plant or the co-host, actually the bacteria or fungi, to extract nitrogen from the air and convert it to a crystallized form that's usable by the host plant and by other plants nearby. And in fact, if you've ever pulled up a long grown-up piece of clover from the lawn and looked at it very closely, you might see little tiny crystals, kind of whitish crystals, and those are the nitrogen nodules. It's an interesting little project to do with a child to explain to them how plants work. And now we come to the category of soil fumigants and pest repellents. And these are the plants that are often used in companion planting because they will help to repel or discourage infestations either in the soil or just above soil level. Now, this is not a particularly well-researched area, and because these plants have toxic properties, that's actually why we're growing them, plant them in limited numbers. For example, Diana Beresford Kroger, in one of her books, notes that according to her research, marigolds will continue to fumigate the soil for up to 3 years after their 1-year annual run in the garden. Some examples of this, dahlias and marigolds, are both good at repelling soil nematodes. And marigolds, of course, have other functions. In fact, I often plant marigolds in areas where I know that there are earwigs, those night predators, fascinating and infuriating little critters that they are. I call them my sacrificial marigolds because the earwigs really, really enjoy munching on marigolds, and that will often cause them to leave other things alone. And dahlias, of course, magnificent ornamental plants. They also have some edible properties, too. Nasturtiums, a great one for repelling whitefly and also the squash bug. And what I note with nasturtiums is that they actually also provide habitat for some of the other soil decomposers, and included in that, of course, are little sow bugs. Petunias will help to repel aphids, tomato hornworms, asparagus beetle, leafhopper, and squash bugs. What a useful plant that is. No wonder they've become such a popular annual, because, of course, they're also really, really ornamental. Radishes, I always plant radishes in and around my cucurbit crop because they're really good at repelling the cucumber beetle and also the cabbage maggot. Summer savory is a useful one for warding off bean beetles. And thyme. Well, thyme has so many wonderful properties. It's an edible herb. It smells magnificent when you walk on it or kneel on it in the garden. It's a great little ground cover, flowers and attracts tons and tons of pollinators. And then it's got these pest repellent and soil fumigant properties where it repels the cabbage looper, the cabbage maggot, corn earworm, whitefly, and tomato hornworm. So who could ask for more from a plant? The insectary function is about attracting beneficial insects, both the pollinators that many of us gardeners are already trying to help, and the predators, namely parasitic wasps. They're called wasps, but they're harmless to us humans. They prey on garden pests like aphids and some caterpillars, so they're a very useful ally in the garden. The characteristics we want in insectary plants are the same thing we tend to want in an ornamental garden. Fragrant flowers, preferably native species, and plants that haven't been tinkered with by breeders. It's good to have a few night-blooming or night-scented plants to help out the nocturnal insects. And of course, we want to provide a food source for insects throughout the growing season. For gardeners, that translates to having color from early spring to late fall. something we tend to want anyway. Yarrow, we've already mentioned. The Lamiaceae family, a huge family comprising about 200 species, includes most of the edible herbs: basil, oregano, marjoram, sage, hyssop, as well as those shown. Other members of this family include bugleweed, Ajuga repens, obedient plant, Physostegia, catnip, lamb's ears, and coleus. For those who are used to growing culinary herbs, using them as insectaries requires something a little counterintuitive. Our herbs tend to taste better before they go to flower, but we really need to let them flower if we want to attract pollinators. This may not be incompatible with culinary usage. Many of these herbs are enthusiastic growers. For example, how many people have just one mint plant? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, I didn't think so. If you have mint, you tend to have a lot of it. So keep some trimmed back for use in the kitchen and let the rest go to flower for the pollinators. They really love those blooms. Many clover flowers are highly attractive to pollinators, and of course they also fix nitrogen. And lilies may not have many other functions, but they're just so gorgeous and fragrant. I always make room for a few. I prefer the oriental lilies to the Asiatic ones because they seem a bit less susceptible to the evil red lily beetle. The Asteraceae family, formerly called Compositae, is even bigger than Lamiaceae, comprising over 1,900 genera and about 32,000 species. So this means just using this family, you should be able to have color all season long. Among the members of the Asteraceae are coneflowers, Rudbeckia, blanket flowers, echinacea, various daisies, fleabane, chrysanthemums, dahlias, zinnias, heleniums, and of course fall-blooming asters. Members of this family tend to look like daisies. So we've provided a lot of food and color for our pollinator friends. What about those parasitic wasps we mentioned? Well, they tend to like members of the carrot family. In addition to those shown on the slide, we can also include cow parsley, celery, parsley, and lovage. Many of these plants are edible, and some are also good host plants for the black swallowtail larva, one caterpillar we want because it grows up to be such a lovely butterfly. Parasitic wasps range from the big, black, rather fierce-looking mud daubers to tiny, microscopic critters, and as I said earlier, these wasps won't bite us. But what they do to the troublesome bugs in our gardens is like something out of a science fiction movie. They will typically find a soft-sided insect, caterpillar or aphid for example, and insert their ovipositor into this unfortunate host. The wasp lays its eggs inside the host, and as the eggs hatch and start to develop, they devour the host from the inside out. If that isn't creepy enough, there's evidence in the scientific literature that some species of wasp larvae are actually able to control their hosts even after the host is dead. Talk about Night of the Living Dead. But as creepy as they sound, these parasitic wasps are a valuable ally in our fight against harmful garden bugs. And our next category of functions are the barrier plants. These we would expect to have at least one of the following three functions, either to prevent the spread of invasive plants, to provide shelter from the wind, or to create a visual or a functional wall. Examples of plants that block growth. Violets. My sister-in-law says that violets are like bunnies. You can't have just one of them, and they do have a very prolific way of spreading around the garden. In fact, I've found that their dense root structure, fibrous root structure, is effective even in blocking goutweed. If you didn't think anything could do that, take it from me, violets can. I was quite impressed. Jerusalem artichoke, sometimes called a sunchoke. It's a plant that looks a little bit like a tall, scrawny sunflower, and it produces an edible root that is quite tasty. But boy, these guys have got a pretty aggressive growth pattern. A number of farmers during the Depression, and I think even before that, were encouraged to plant sunchokes as a food crop. but the market for them never really took off, and I suspect some of those farmers or their descendants may still be trying to get rid of Jerusalem artichoke. So be a little careful about how you plant this one. Sunflowers we've talked about already in the context of them being an allelopathic plant. You want to be careful how many of these you plant and how often you plant them in the same place, because the allelopathic properties will endure in the soil for a number of seasons. And big root geranium, this is one that the roots are actually above ground. It tends to have very dense leafy growth. Makes a nice low-growing border plant, not only because its dense growth will shade out other weeds, but it also has a fragrance which I find very attractive, but a lot of animals don't like it. So if you have problems with dogs or cats getting into your flower beds, try a border of big root geranium. That just might keep them out of your more ornamental plants. In the category of windbreaks, well, of course, we're all familiar, at least all of us in Ottawa are familiar with the Friends of the Farm shelter belt along Merivale Road. I like the term fedge, which is another, like permaculture, it's a made-up word comprised of the words fruit or food and hedge. So it's the idea of making a hedge out of edible plants, and some examples of what you can grow in a fedge. Evergreens such as cedar, not great food value, but certainly a plant that was used extensively by our pioneer ancestors, who would brew up the cedar greens during the winter to make a tea that at least was high in vitamin C and kept them from getting scurvy. Hazelnuts, you'll need 2 because they're not self-fertile. Same with Nanking cherries, lilacs. Ornamental rather than edible, but some people make quite tasty jelly with the flowers. And of course there are many, many other choices, service berries, lots and lots of things you could plant in your fedge. And then we have the example of living walls. I threw Devil's Walking Stick in there, Aralia spinosa, actually as a bit of a joke, because you might want to check with your liability insurance before planting this thing. This is a wicked looking plant with spikes that'll take your eye out. Thistles, the Canada thistles, very ornamental. Again, slightly thuggish, but they do a good job as living walls, as do ornamental grasses and dense vines. And of course, we've already spoken about the many positive properties of the native Virginia creeper. And now we come to the category of wildlife nurturers. Now, my garden is certified as backyard habitat by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. This is actually an easy and fun thing to do, especially if you have children or grandchildren that you garden with. Gives you great bragging rights with the neighbors, and the application will cost you, I believe, something in the order of $10. Essentially, in this category, we want plants that are going to offer food, shelter, nesting materials, or nest sites. And the Canadian Wildlife Federation has a fabulous resource site where you can find out about all kinds of native plants, plants that offer various kinds of habitat for insects, for birds, ground-dwelling critters, and I highly recommend you consult their website for more information on this topic. And finally, we come to the category of plants for human use. After all, that's, we're the gardeners, that's what we want. We want to find some usefulness in our garden. This may include food plants. Of course, most of us tend to think of annuals when we think of food plants, but there are also perennial food plants. Conventional ones, such as the perennial herbs and things like asparagus, or woody fruit trees and bushes, and some unconventional ones. For example, if you've never tried the spring shoots of Tradescantia or spiderwort, give it a try this spring. I recommend it. You'll find them quite tasty. A number of herbs and tree barks and flowers can also be used for medicinal purposes. Big caution here, make sure you consult a professional. Fuel wood is not necessarily something that we think of in our gardens. However, willow and beech and poplar are species that have been used traditionally for centuries for coppicing. This is a form of cutting back just the smaller branches and allowing the stool or the trunk of the tree to continue living and putting out new shoots every year. And then we want some craft materials, perhaps. I grow grapes. Don't get a lot of grapes. The raccoons tend to get most of them. But I've used the grapevines that I trim off for various crafting projects. And of course, we grow pretty things too, which can be turned into dried flowers. And so there's lots of usefulness that we can, as humans, can derive from our garden. And now finally we come to some examples of plant guilds. And to give credit where credit is due, all of these examples that I'm going to show you come from a free ebook written by Bryce Ruddock and available through Midwest Permaculture. Midwest Permaculture is based in Ohio, which is a little bit warmer than we are here in the Ottawa Valley, so use caution when looking at the species. I've suggested some alternatives in the guilds that I'm showing you here. The other thing I want to note is that in all of the next three diagrams, north is at the top of the page, and each of these guilds was designed to fit into a 30-foot diameter or 10-meter diameter space. So this makes them quite doable in a regular suburban garden. So our first guild is the bee guild. This is designed to attract pollinators. Our central tree here is a little leaf linden tree. For those who are not familiar with the little leaf linden, it is the leaves that are little. The tree itself is regular sized. That came as a bit of a shock to some neighbors who planted one thinking it was going to be a dwarf tree. Any substitutions that we make in the plant materials surrounding our central tree should take into consideration the needs of the pollinators, because as I said, that is the purpose of this particular guild. However, as we've been talking all the way through, keep in mind that idea that you want to have a comprehensive ecosystem. And consequently, we're not looking for single-purpose plants. We want plants that are going to serve multiple functions. Now, the linden tree, Tilia cordata, it's not a native tree. However, it does have a beautiful compact pyramidal shape. It's tolerant of pollution. It has fabulously fragrant flowers. If you've ever been near a linden tree in the late spring when it's blooming, it's just buzzing with pollinators. Linden flower tea is considered valuable as an anti-inflammatory and for respiratory problems. Again, consult your doctor first before brewing some up. And the young leaves can be eaten as a salad green. What else are we showing here? Now, Rosa pomifera, also known as Rosa villosa, may not be fully hardy in your area, but you can see that down here on the south side of the tree we've got some Rosa rugosas, and those certainly are quite hardy for the Ottawa Valley, so they could be substitutes. Rosa woodsii or pavement rose could also be used. They're a shorter plant and might not produce quite as much shelter as the Rosa pomifera would, so that would be a consideration. We've got some lovage, which is great for attracting the predatory wasps and is also an edible herb. Spring bulbs over in the lower right-hand corner of the screen would be succeeded by turtlehead, which blooms later in the year. And then on the west side of our guild, we've got mint, garlic, and chives, more edible herbs, dill, parsley, caraway, and some echinacea for late season color. Now we come to the evergreen guild, and this is a tremendously useful assembly for anyone who's burdened with a surplus of evergreens. It's one of the more common questions that we get as master gardeners. I've got a big evergreen tree, might be a pine, hemlock, spruce, cedar. What can I plant underneath it? So this guild is actually one that works quite well for an established garden. Once again, north is at the top. The space required is roughly 10 meters in diameter, so this should fit into a regular city garden lot. What we do see here is that at the north and east side of our pine tree, we're not trying to grow anything. There just won't be enough light. The lingonberries, which require a fair bit of sun, are on the south side, and they're actually out beyond the drip line. So lingonberries is one option. It wouldn't be my first choice. They're low-growing, fairly scrubby plants, and I don't particularly like the taste of the fruit very much. If I had an evergreen and the space to grow things around it, I think I'd probably consider something like haskaps, which are more or less the same size as the lingonberries, perhaps slightly taller, and definitely produce a fruit that I would prefer eating. You could also consider currant bushes or gooseberries. They're going to be a little bit larger, so you wouldn't be able to put quite as many. Or potentially a Nanking, not one, but two Nanking cherries. They also are quite scrubby plants, so tend to have a slightly messy look about them. Just on the west side of our evergreen, we're seeing some sweet Cicely. And that's actually a really nice little perennial European herb. Myrus odorata is the Latin for it. It's both edible and it has some medicinal properties, keeping in mind my caution about making your own home remedies. And it also has a very pretty little white flower in the spring. We have some daffodils. Getting up towards the sort of northwest corner of the tree, we've got hardy geranium and lamium. So if nothing else, this planting combination will provide some inspiration for those of you who do have a big evergreen and aren't sure what to plant around it. And finally, we come to the serviceberry guild. I love serviceberries. They're a really, really terrific tree. Again, north is at the top of this image, and the diameter of this grouping, because serviceberries are relatively small trees, can range from 6 to 15 meters. So again, something that will fit into a regular suburban garden quite well. There are a number of varieties of serviceberries. They're fully hardy in the Ottawa Valley area. Amelanchier canadensis is the one most commonly used, and it has traditionally been a multi-stemmed plant. However, the breeders have very busily and creatively come up with species that are single-stemmed, which works quite well in a smaller garden. Now, had I the room and the wisdom of hindsight, I probably would have picked the multi-branched species, because with serviceberries, which bloom in the early spring and fruit right around Canada Day with a lovely big bluish black fruit that tastes a bit like a blueberry. Very popular with the wildlife, let me tell you. And my tall, slender, single-stemmed serviceberry, I can harvest about a third of the way up the tree, and then I have to leave the rest of the berries for the birds and the squirrels, and they do appreciate that. This is actually a tree that has 4-season interest. Lovely early spring blooms, delicious fruit, beautiful fall colors, and then attractive smooth bark and an interesting branching structure for winter interest. We have on the subsidiary plantings, we've got hazelnuts, and I'd like to point out once again that you do need 2 hazelnuts. 2 different cultivars of hazelnut to get nuts. That, of course, is also theoretical because it assumes that you're going to be able to beat the squirrels to the punch. Good luck with that. Dwarf fruit trees. could be added. Now, as I mentioned, the serviceberry is already a fairly small fruit tree, so you might want to think about currants, which are even more low growing. We've got some spring bulbs and mint over on the west side of the tree. On the east side, we've got a gooseberry or currant bush, lemon balm, comfrey, that mulch plant that we started off talking about. You can throw in some strawberries or borage and aromatic herbs like dill and parsley. In fact, there's a lot you can do with this particular plant guild. It's a very versatile one. The purpose of this slide is twofold. Firstly, to show you what a real tree guild looks like, as opposed to those nice, neat diagrams we've been looking at. This is the northwest corner of my garden, and it is a serviceberry guild. Here's my little Princess Diana serviceberry. But secondly, I want to introduce you to some of the unconventional edible perennials. Stephen Barstow, author of Around the World in 80 Plants, calls these edimentals, and many of you will be familiar with the ornamental properties of these plants, but you may not know that they're also edible. So first up in the extreme left-hand lower corner, we have a little bit of bee balm. Not only is it a pretty flower that attracts pollinators, but it's very tasty in salads and makes a very delicious herbal tea. Behind that, we have a bit of tricolor marjoram, a great ground cover, and also an edible herb. The tulip, the pink tulip behind that, is edible, as are all tulips. In the middle of the picture, we have this fluffy chartreuse shrub, which is an elderberry, Sunderland Gold, I believe it was. Unfortunately, elderberries need wet soil, and my soil is pure sand and 99% bone dry, so poor old Sunderland Gold, I believe it was, did not survive. In front of this, in the foreground middle right, we have a spiky-looking plant, which is Tradescantia, widow's tears, or spiderwort, are two of the common names. And this one is very edible and really quite delicious. It's worth trying. Tradescantia is a pretty vigorous grower, so you still don't want to exceed the 1/3 rule, but harvest before the plant goes to flower. Your shoots should be 30 to 45 centimeters tall, and you're going to use the bottom part of each shoot, which is more white and has less chlorophyll in it. And slice it up, add it to salads. It's really delicious. To the right of that, we have an Elba marginata hosta, and like all hostas, this is quite edible too. You need to blanch it, meaning to deprive it of sunlight. Again, keeping in mind the 1/3 rule, as your hosta begins to emerge from the ground in the early spring and those shoots look like big fat pencil points, you're going to put a box or a bucket over about 1/3 of the plant and then harvest in a few weeks' time after they've grown up a bit. It tastes a lot like Boston lettuce, sweet and delicious. That splash of purple in the middle ground on the right is a couple of alliums. All parts of the allium are edible. You can add a few bits of flour to your salads for an extra bit of color and some oniony flavor. Of course, if you harvest and eat the bulbs, you only get to do that once. To the right of that, we have a ball cedar, which we've discussed is a great source of vitamin C if you can't get it any other way. And then behind that, we have Nanking cherry. It's kind of a shrubby looking blur of green. And to be honest, it's not a particularly attractive plant, and it really needs a mate in order to produce good fruiting. So I don't get very many fruit because I only have room for one in my garden. And in the middle here, we have that Virginia creeper that I've been telling you about. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I couldn't quite master the technology of inserting some video, so here's a picture of me in my gardening getup. And I hope this presentation has whetted your appetite to learn more about plant guilds and sustainable gardening with perennial edible plants. And to help you on your journey, here's a couple of resources that I've mentioned. Midwest Permaculture, you can Google that term and look for their free e-booklet, which provides several different examples of plant guilds in addition to the ones that I showed here in this presentation. And secondly, I just mentioned Around the World in 80 Plants by Stephen Barstow, a very useful reference for learning more about edible plants. Thanks and happy gardening.